There's a specific kind of horror reserved for ancient battlefields. Modern warfare kills you quickly if you're unlucky. A bullet, an explosion, over in seconds. But ancient warfare? Ancient warfare had time. Time to be creative. Time to make dying as terrifying and agonizing as possible. Because killing the enemy wasn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal was making sure everyone watching never forgot what happened. Making sure survivors went home and told stories, so disturbing that entire regions surrendered rather than face the same fate. These methods sound like fiction, like something too horrific to be real, but they happened. They were documented, and they were used not occasionally but systematically. If you're into the darkest parts of history that don't make it into textbooks, subscribe to Disturbed Historian. We're exploring the warfare methods that civilizations would rather you forget. Let's start with scaphism. The Persians allegedly created this execution method, though its actual use is debated by historians. But the description exists in ancient sources, and it's so elaborately terrible that even if it was rare, the fact that someone conceived it is disturbing enough. Scaphism, also called the boats, involved trapping a victim between two boats or hollowed logs. Only their head, hands, and feet were exposed. They'd be force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. Then, more honey would be poured on the exposed parts of their body. They'd be left floating in a stagnant pond. The honey attracted insects, flies, wasps. The mixture of honey and the victim's own waste created a breeding ground. Insects would lay eggs in the victim's excreta and festering wounds. The victim would be kept alive, force-fed more milk and honey daily to prevent them from dying too quickly. The goal was extending the torture for as long as possible, sometimes reportedly up to 17 days. The insects would burrow into the victim's flesh. Maggots would consume them from the inside. The exposed areas would become gangrenous. The victim would be conscious through much of this, watching their own body being consumed by insects and rot. The psychological torture was possibly worse than the physical. You're immobilized. You can see what's happening. You can feel it. And you know there's no escape. Ancient sources describe one particular victim, a Persian soldier named Mithridates, who supposedly survived 17 days in the boats. 17 days of insects burrowing into his flesh, 17 days of fever and pain, and watching his own body decompose. Whether this specific case happened is uncertain, but the method was documented by multiple Greek historians. Even if rarely used, scaphism existed as a psychological weapon. The threat of it. The knowledge that surrender or betrayal might result in being put in the boats. That fear controlled people as effectively as the actual execution. The Romans had crucifixion, which everyone knows about. But what's often sanitized is how deliberately engineered it was for maximum suffering. Crucifixion wasn't just nailing someone to wood. It was a carefully designed torture that could keep someone alive for days. The victim's position was calculated. Arms stretched, but not so much that death came quickly from suffocation. A small seat or footrest provided just enough support that the victim could push themselves up slightly to breathe. This prolonged the process. Death from crucifixion came from exhaustion and asphyxiation. As muscles tired from holding the body up, breathing became harder. The victim would push up on the nails through their feet to catch a breath. This created a horrific cycle. Push up, breathe, collapse from pain, suffocate slightly, panic, push up again. This could continue for days. The Romans sometimes broke the victim's legs to speed death by removing the ability to push up and breathe. That was considered mercy. But crucifixion's real purpose wasn't just execution. It was public terrorism. Crucifixions happened along roads, in public squares, where everyone could see. The Romans crucified thousands of people during the Spartacus revolt, lining the Appian Way with crosses for miles. Imagine traveling that road, 6,000 crucified slaves, some still alive, some rotting. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you rebel. This is what Rome does to enemies. Fear us. The Assyrians, one of the most militaristic civilizations in history, perfected psychological warfare through horror. They didn't just kill enemies. They made examples. One method was impalement, not the quick vertical impalement through vital organs. The Assyrians used carefully designed stakes that entered the body at angles calculated to avoid immediately vital organs. The stake would be inserted through the rectum or abdomen and positioned to emerge from the shoulder or chest, avoiding the heart. The victim could survive on the stake for hours or even days. The Assyrians would display impaled victims outside conquered cities, rows of stakes with dying people on them, screaming, begging, visible from distance. The psychological impact on defenders in nearby cities was devastating. You'd see what awaited you if you resisted. You'd hear the screams, smell the blood and excrement, and you'd have to decide, fight and potentially end up on those stakes or surrender immediately. Assyrian kings bragged about this in their inscriptions. They described impaling thousands of prisoners, skinning people alive, cutting off noses, ears, hands, building pyramids of severed heads outside city gates. This wasn't propaganda exaggeration. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts from multiple sources confirm the Assyrians practiced systematic terror. They weaponized cruelty, made it part of military doctrine. The goal was making resistance so horrifying that cities surrendered without fighting. The brazen bull, allegedly invented in ancient Greece, was a bronze sculpture of a bull that doubled as an execution device. The victim was locked inside the hollow bronze bull. A fire was lit underneath. As the metal heated, the person inside was slowly roasted alive. But the design included an acoustic system. Tubes in the bull's head converted the victim's screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellowing. This served two purposes: entertainment for the audience watching and muffling the human screams enough that the execution seemed less disturbing. The inventor, Parallaeus, allegedly presented it to Phalaris, tyrant of Sicily, as a gift. Phalaris was supposedly so impressed that he tested it immediately on Parallaeus himself, making the inventor the device's first victim. Whether this specific story is true is debated. But bronze bull devices existed. They've been referenced in multiple ancient sources. The method was real even if the origin story is uncertain. Death in the brazen bull was excruciating. Bronze conducts heat efficiently. The temperature inside would climb steadily. The victim would experience increasingly severe burns. The air would become superheated, burning lungs with each breath. Dehydration would set in rapidly. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical. You're locked in darkness. The walls are getting hotter. You can't escape. You know exactly what's happening and can do nothing but wait for death while an audience outside hears your suffering transformed into animal sounds. Decimation was a Roman military punishment that combined execution with psychological destruction of unit cohesion. When a legion or cohort was judged cowardly or mutinous, every 10th man would be executed by his fellow soldiers. The selection was random, often by drawing lots. Then the 9 survivors would beat the selected man to death with clubs and stones. They had to participate. Refusal meant joining the condemned. This created multiple layers of trauma. First, the randomness. You could be a good soldier and still be selected for death because of bad luck. Second, the forced participation. You had to kill your comrade, someone you'd fought beside, shared meals with, trusted with your life. You had to beat him to death with your own hands. Third, the survivors carried that guilt and trauma forever. Unit cohesion was shattered. Trust was destroyed. Decimation wasn't common, but it was used enough that it remained a threat throughout Roman military history. The fear of it enforced discipline. Soldiers knew that failure or cowardice could result not just in their own death, but in being forced to kill their friends or being killed by them. That psychological leverage was more effective than any punishment, targeting only the individual offender. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, faced a specific problem after the Battle of Cannae. He'd captured thousands of Roman soldiers but couldn't feed or guard them all. He needed information from some, so he allegedly forced Roman prisoners to fight each other to the death in gladiatorial combat, with the winner earning freedom initially. But as the combats continued, the promises changed. Winners might be sold into slavery instead, or forced to fight again. The psychology was devastating. Kill your fellow soldier for the promise of freedom that might not come, or refuse indefinitely die. This turned prisoners against each other, destroyed morale, created internal competition and resentment. The survivors carried guilt and trauma. But from Hannibal's perspective, it was efficient. It eliminated prisoners who needed resources, entertained his troops, and broke the spirit of Rome's captured soldiers so completely that even if they eventually returned home, they were psychologically destroyed. Ancient commanders understood that breaking an enemy's will was often more valuable than simply killing them. A dead soldier is gone. A traumatized soldier who returns home spreads fear, tells stories, makes others less willing to fight. The most effective ancient warfare wasn't about killing efficiently. It was about killing horrifically, making death so terrible that the story of it became a weapon. Elephants were used in ancient warfare not just for their size and power, but for their ability to kill in uniquely terrifying ways. War elephants trained for execution would sometimes crush prisoners beneath their feet. Slowly, the elephant would be commanded to place one foot on the victim and gradually apply pressure. Bones would break. Internal organs would rupture. The victim remained conscious through much of it, and the audience watching learned exactly what happened to enemies of the state. Some elephants were trained to dismember prisoners. They'd use their trunks to tear limbs from bodies, or their tusks to gore victims in ways that maximized suffering. These executions were public, theatrical. The elephant became both executioner and symbol of the state's power. The message: we command nature itself. Even these massive animals obey us. What chance do you have? The Carthaginians, Indians, and several other ancient civilizations used elephants this way. The psychological impact was immense. Elephants are intelligent. They can be gentle. Watching one methodically kill a human on command demonstrated total control. It showed that the state could turn even noble creatures into instruments of torture. That perversion of nature was its own kind of horror. The Catherine wheel, used in medieval and ancient times, involved breaking a victim's limbs with an iron rod or hammer, then threading their broken body through a wagon wheel. The wheel would be displayed publicly, often elevated on a pole. The victim typically didn't die immediately from the breaking. They'd survive for hours or days, exposed to elements with shattered bones, unable to move in constant agony. The wheel method served multiple purposes: public humiliation, extended suffering, visible warning to others. The victim became a living monument to state power. The breaking of bones was methodical. Arms and legs would be struck repeatedly at multiple points to ensure complete shattering. The joints would be dislocated. Then the limp, broken body would be woven through the wheel's spokes, with limbs bent backward in unnatural positions. Death came eventually from shock, exposure, dehydration, or infection. But the timeline was uncertain. Some victims survived for days. The executioner could control the speed of death by determining where and how hard to strike. Careful executioners could keep victims alive longer. That skill was valued. The goal was maximum suffering over maximum time. Quick deaths were failures. The job was torture, not just execution. Molten metals were used for execution in various ancient cultures. Gold was sometimes used for symbolic executions of the greedy, silver for traitors. Lead was more common because it was cheaper. The molten metal would be poured down the victim's throat or over their head. Death was rapid from this method, but the moments before death were unimaginable agony. The liquid metal would destroy tissue instantly, cause massive internal burns, boil blood and organs. Some accounts describe the molten metal being poured slowly, drop by drop, to extend the torture. A single drop of molten gold on skin causes severe burns. Multiple drops over time create layers of suffering. The victim would be restrained, unable to escape, watching the executioner prepare the crucible, heat the metal, and then slowly administer the punishment. The anticipation was part of the torture. Marcus Crassus, the Roman general, was allegedly killed this way by Parthians. After his defeat, molten gold was poured down his throat as mockery of his famous wealth. Whether this specific account is accurate is debated, but the method was documented and used. The symbolism was powerful. The thing you valued most becomes the instrument of your death. Your greed, your wealth, your ambition literally kills you. Keel hauling was a naval punishment used in ancient and later maritime warfare. The victim would be tied to a rope that passed under the ship's keel. They'd be thrown overboard on one side and pulled under the ship to emerge on the other side. The ship's hull was covered in barnacles and other sharp marine growth. Being dragged across it flayed skin and flesh. If the victim didn't drown during the underwater passage, they'd emerge severely lacerated and often died from the injuries or infection. The Mediterranean galleys of ancient times used variations of this. The punishment was reserved for severe infractions, mutiny, desertion, striking an officer. It was public. The crew would watch. The message was clear. This ship has absolute authority. The captain's word is law. Defy it, and the sea itself becomes your executioner. The victim's screams, the blood in the water, the sight of shredded flesh, all reinforced discipline through terror. Some victims survived keel hauling, but they were never the same. The physical scars were obvious. The psychological trauma was deeper. You'd been pulled through drowning and flaying, simultaneously, helpless, completely at the mercy of the rope and the men pulling it. That experience broke people. Survivors often became the most obedient crew members. The torture had achieved its purpose. The Blood Eagle, attributed to Vikings, though its historical reality is heavily debated, was described in Norse sagas. The victim's ribs would be cut from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings. The lungs would be pulled through the opening. Some accounts say salt would be rubbed into the wounds. If this was actually performed, death would come from shock, blood loss, or suffocation as the lungs were damaged and exposed. Whether the Blood Eagle was real or propaganda is unclear. No archaeological evidence confirms it, but it appears in multiple sagas, described in enough detail that it was at least conceived. And conception matters. Even if rarely or never actually performed, the idea of it served a purpose. Vikings had a reputation for savage brutality. Stories like the Blood Eagle reinforced that reputation, made enemies more likely to surrender or pay tribute rather than fight. The Norse sagas were oral traditions written down later. They may have exaggerated or invented elements for dramatic effect, but they reflected cultural values. The willingness to describe such methods, even fictionally, indicates a society that valued fearsome reputation, that understood psychological warfare. The Blood Eagle might be legend, but it's a legend that served strategic purposes. Fear is a weapon. Stories are delivery systems. Crushing by elephant had a specific variation in ancient India and Southeast Asia. The elephant would be commanded to place its foot on the victim's head, slowly. The pressure would increase gradually. The skull would begin to crack. The victim would feel it, hear it, know exactly what was happening. Then the final pressure would come. The skull would shatter. Brain matter would explode outward. Death was certain, but the approach was prolonged enough to maximize terror. This method was used for high-profile executions, royalty, military leaders, people whose deaths needed to make statements. The elephant? Execution was theatrical, public, ritualized. It demonstrated the state's power over life and death. It showed control over nature, and it created a spectacle that spectators never forgot. Those who witnessed elephant executions carried those memories forever, shared the stories, spread the fear. The elephants themselves were often decorated for executions, painted, adorned with bells and fabrics. This wasn't casual violence. It was ceremony. The formality made it worse. This wasn't rage or passion. It was calculated, systematic. The state had decided you would die, had chosen the method, had prepared the elephant and the stage. Your death was inevitable and scheduled. That certainty, that inability to escape or hope for mercy, was its own unique psychological torture. Ancient Chinese warfare included several horrifying execution methods. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, involved slowly removing pieces of the victim's body. Small cuts, methodical. The executioner's skill determined how long the victim survived. A good executioner could keep someone alive through hundreds of cuts over hours or days. The cuts were strategic, avoiding vital organs and major arteries, maximizing pain while preventing death. This method was reserved for the worst crimes. Treason, patricide, particularly severe murders. It was public, educational. The dying criminal's suffering was meant to deter others. The crowd watching learned exactly what happened to those who committed unforgivable offenses. The spectacle served social control. But it also reveals something disturbing about human nature. These executions drew crowds. People wanted to watch, brought families. The normalization of torture as public entertainment appears across many ancient cultures. The executioner in Lingqi had status. Skill was required. Too much cutting too fast meant the victim died prematurely. Too slow meant the process dragged and the crowd lost interest. There was an art to it, a technique passed down. That professionalization of torture is perhaps more disturbing than the torture itself. It wasn't passionate violence. It was a craft, a job, something people trained for and took pride in doing well. Pouring molten substances into body orifices was used across multiple cultures: ears, nose, throat. Genitals. The liquid would be heated until boiling, then carefully poured. The internal burns were catastrophic. Death came from shock, internal bleeding, or organ failure. But the moments of administration were pure agony. The victim would be restrained, unable to move, unable to close or protect the targeted orifice, forced to accept the torture. This method appeared in accounts from ancient Persia, Mongolia, and medieval Europe. It was used for traitors and spies, people who'd whispered secrets or listened to forbidden information. The symbolism was explicit. You used these ears to hear what you shouldn't. Now they're destroyed. You use this mouth to speak treason. Now it's burned shut. The punishment matched the crime in grotesque metaphor. The preparation was part of the torture. The victim would watch the substance being heated, would know what was coming. That anticipation, that dread, that was calculated. By the time the actual execution began, the victim was already psychologically destroyed. The physical torture was almost secondary to the mental anguish of waiting and knowing. What makes ancient warfare executions particularly horrifying, isn't just their creativity or brutality. It's their systematic nature. These weren't crimes of passion. They were policy. They were military doctrine. They were legal punishments approved by governments and cheered by crowds. The torture wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. It served purposes: deterrence, entertainment, social control, psychological warfare. Modern humans like to think we've evolved past this, that we're more civilized, more humane, and in many ways, laws and international conventions have reduced state-sanctioned torture. But the capacity for it hasn't disappeared. The psychology that enabled ancient crowds to watch people being slowly killed in horrible ways, that's still human psychology. We're the same species, the same brains, the same capacity for rationalizing cruelty when we believe it serves a purpose. These methods weren't secrets. They were public, documented, bragged about in inscriptions and histories. Kings commissioned reliefs showing their enemies being impaled or flayed. Generals wrote dispatches describing how many prisoners they'd executed and how. The openness is revealing. There was no shame, no sense that these acts needed hiding. Brutality was power. The willingness to torture was strength. Mercy was weakness. Some of these methods are disputed by historians. Evidence is fragmentary. Sources are sometimes questionable. But even the disputed methods tell us something. They tell us what people believed was possible, what they thought their enemies might do, what they themselves were willing to threaten. The line between what actually happened and what people believed could happen is less important than the fact that these ideas existed, were discussed, were used as threats. Fear of the brazen bull controlled behavior, even if actual brazen bulls were rare. The worst ways to die in ancient warfare weren't accidents. They were engineering. Humans deliberately designed ways to make death as agonizing, as prolonged, as psychologically devastating as possible, not because they were uniquely evil, but because it worked, because torture as spectacle controlled populations, because horrific executions deterred rebellion and encouraged surrender, because cruelty was effective policy. That's the disturbing lesson. These methods persisted for centuries because they achieved their goals. They weren't abandoned because humans became more moral. They were abandoned because warfare evolved, because international laws were established, because public torture became politically inconvenient. But the underlying psychology, the willingness to inflict suffering to achieve objectives, that hasn't disappeared. It's just been constrained by modern structures. Remove those structures, and history suggests humans revert to familiar patterns remarkably quickly.